Renewable Energy. This is Cleveland Jones. No, sorry, this is Paul Taylor,
Yes.
consultant geophysicist. You can access his LinkedIn page, that's the screen here, and see more details about Paul. And this is Cleveland Jones, the same LinkedIn page. Please access and see Cleveland States. And this is me. Okay, each participant has up to 12 minutes with slides, and the audience can submit questions through live comments on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, X. Paul, could you please start?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Tonight I'm going to present some thoughts about renewable energy. And if you could go to the next slide, please.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk about its inception as a quirky technology to its fast becoming dominance in the energy market today. Previously, we didn't really refer to it as renewable. We just called it alternative energy, and it ranged from solar power through to biofuels, such as bioethanol and fuel being derived from reused cooking oil. But tonight I'm going to concentrate on the main sources of renewable energy. Next slide, please. In the beginning, there were many people around the world who didn't have access to electricity or gas. These were mostly households, farms, etc. And they relied on coal or wood for their cooking and heating, but they had to consider options for providing electrical power to their premises. They needed to power their household appliances, for example. And so they not instigated, but they investigated the use of alternative sources such as solar panels and windmills for generating power supply. And then once they'd done that, they quickly found that these alternative sources of energy were providing savings. Yes, they had large upfront costs, but the operation of these alternative sources were saving them money. And of course, they went out, they went to church, they went to the mosque, or wherever they went, they would tell people about it. And so new people were then onboarding with this technology, and we saw some growth. And of course, later came along the global climate, and the impact it was having on daily lives. And so people like Greenpeace saw it as a green energy, and it was taken on board by a lot of people. And eventually, government level, it was seen as the future. But the governments also have other issues, such as energy security, because we've seen quite a lot in the last century and in this century how energy can be used as a bargaining chip, especially during the saber rattling phases prior to a conflict, or as a means of leveraging by less military powerful nations against the more powerful countries. Governments have learned that they must diversify their energy sources so they cannot be held to ransom. So, renewable, sustainable energy sources are seen as a way of reducing that reliability on accessing the fossil fuel market, where diplomatic situations could mean a country finding itself facing difficulties in obtaining the energy that it needs for its own country. And the next slide, please. So They started at the beginning, as I've said. Many households, farms, etc., they were not connected to a gas or electricity grid, and they were forced to either invest in extending the gas pipelines to their property or the electrical ducting to power their homes, farms, offices, or factories. And the cost of doing this was could be quite overwhelming, and it forced owners to consider alternative sources of energy. Heating and cooking was easily overcome with wood, for example, or the use of LPG, gas bottles that they could connect up quite easily. Yes, there were downsides to that because you'd always have to make sure that you've got spare gas available for that time when you would inevitably run out of gas. However, lighting and household appliances, office equipment, and machinery needed electricity. And especially on farms that could be quite remote, they need machinery to work. And then, but this was overcome with the investment in either windmills or solar panels that carried the necessary heavy upfront cost of installation. But the consumers soon found that they not only had a cheap source of energy, but one that was sustainable. And of course, they, as I've said, they would then go out boasting about what they had, and this promoted the onboarding and the encouragement to others to experiment with this new, cheaper form of energy. And later, then, we soon started to see corporate investment with the building of wind and solar farms in the countrysides and offshore. And these farms were supplying a much cheaper form of electricity than the traditional power coming from the established grids. And some consumers often found themselves being able to sell surplus power back to the power generation companies, and thus propagating the virtue of renewable energy and furthering the adoption of this technology. And with the advent of social networking, online social networking, this certainly had a major part to play in the adoption of this alternative renewable energy source because people would see the posts, they would see the praise being given about the alternative energy and adopted it themselves. So the alternative sources were soon very quickly becoming the norm, and people would talk about being connected to the grid that was coming from the local wind farm or from a solar panel farm. But then later, this adoption was taken up by the global warming campaigners because they saw the renewables as green technology for generating electricity. And as we're seeing now, the anti fossil fuel campaigners are all um, talking about the renewable energy as the future for the world. So, renewable energy became a de facto catchphrase of the green campaigners and governments alike. And we have dropped the use of alternative energy as the phrase. And the next slide, please. So, traditional oil and gas companies, they started to 7 or 8 years ago, they started to rebrand themselves as energy companies rather than oil and or gas companies because they quickly recognized that renewables were more than just a trendy fashion and that energy source was here to stay. BP and Shell have rebranded themselves. And they're also major vendors of solar panels in many parts of the world, most notably in African and Southeast Asian countries. But with the advent of climate change and the global warming that's becoming apparent and making the news headlines, campaigners, anti fossil fuel activists, and now the net zero carbon footprint goals set by organizations such as the United Nations and the European Union is the leading reason given for the adoption of renewable energy and the reduction of the world's reliance on fossil fuels. Government sponsorship. Governments have come in and they are actively trying to get their population to adopt renewable energy to reduce carbon footprint. And this is the new catchphrase, carbon footprint reduction. They're offering sponsorship through grants to people so that they can transition from their heating and or air conditioning powered by oil and gas generated electricity with heat pump installation as a specific example. But they also promote and facilitate a connection to energy supply generated by onshore and offshore wind farms and or solar farms. But also governments are thinking about energy security because countries do not want to be ransomed by another um, country with a removable of energy source. Next slide, please. So we're seeing political change, and one of the political changes that we see mostly is that governments can be held at the mercy of other energy suppliers. I'm not talking about companies, I'm talking about other countries. And war itself is a game changer. Now, we've seen wars since World War One, and we've seen how those wars can affect energy prices. Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine had an immediate impact, and it showed that many countries, especially in Europe, their reliance on Russian oil and gas had a very severe and detrimental effect on their ability to generate electricity, heat homes, and run factories. And this can affect the voting population. And so governments would be naturally worried about whether they were going to be re-elected or not. And with the impact of restricted energy supply, we see major price changes, and this will affect manufacturing. It will, heating, everything, and it will drive up inflation. And we have seen that since the Russian invasion. And this damages the economies of those countries affected by the restriction in their energy supply. European countries now have found a way to wean themselves off Russian energy. And it will be interesting to see if they can remain off the Russian energy radar. They have suffered, for example, with the attack on the pipeline in the Baltic Sea, and the effects were quite obvious in places like Germany on such an action. Next slide, please. Now, present day energy price volatility is still apparent, although we have seen quite a few years with stable oil and gas prices. But the internationally traded gas price more than quadrupled in 2021. And those energy prices drove up the cost of living for the normal person in the street, and inflation. Everything affects their take-home pay and how they can spend that money and how much money they have to spend. But there's very little that most governments can do about the wholesale price of gas itself. And as we know, though Those of us who have worked in the oil and gas industry, those companies have to make huge financial investments in extracting the hydrocarbons from the shelf. And those investments can take years to mature. But then, as those assets themselves mature, the companies have to think about the enormous financial implication of decommissioning the fields. And those costs can be astronomical. So the volatility of the market has an immediate and radical impact on the oil and gas prices, and the scale stretches from household to national and regional economies. Next slide, please. Now, the adoption and promotion of renewable energy by governments and green advocates now comes under the banner of reducing our carbon footprint to try and lessen the impact of global warming. And we all have heard organizations such as the United Nations saying that they want to keep temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next few years. So it's no longer under the flag of reduced cost to the consumer. And this climate change and green advocacy is having major organizations change their policies, such as the United Nations are forcing both the governments and populations to consider that climate change is happening and that green renewable energy is the only future. Whether that's true or not is a debatable point. And those governments are adopting their net zero targets with the imposition of the ban on sale of fossil fuel vehicles from 2030 onwards. And those car making companies are also stopping production and manufacturing of fossil fuel cars. So we're seeing EV cars and vehicles, and even now planes are becoming or the removal of using fossil fuels to power them. So we're seeing economic and environmental benefits as the key drivers for the adoption of renewable energy. And as I've said before, the households, right at that household level, they are being helped financially to change their energy sources with heat pumps and or power generated by wind and solar farms. Next slide, please.
Yeah, please, Paul, we have 16, 17 minutes. Use it so if you can go to the
Sure.
end.
Okay, where are we now? Well, in 2010, the global weighted average levelized cost of electricity was 95% higher than fossil fuel. But now it's 50%. Well, new offshore wind farms are 52% lower than the cheapest fossil fuel-fired solutions. And that is something to really think about. China has been the main driver of the global decline in costs for solar panels and offshore wind. So costs are coming down. And if we go to the next slide, you can see clearly here how, with the exception of geothermal, all the costs have reduced dramatically. The capacity factors have increased, and the cost of the electricity being generated has reduced remarkably. So solar, wind, bioenergy, I believe, they do have quite a future. And in the next slide, you can see the savings being made by the regions and by the technology being used to reduce. And these are big numbers. For example, Asia is almost $200 billion in savings. And if we go to the next slide, this comes from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, showing how at the top you've got electricity generation, what feeds into it, and how they supply the residential, commercial, industrial sectors. Petroleum is still the major energy source for transportation. And then the next slide, where are we going with renewables? Well, biofuel is still quite quirky, let's put it that way. Wind power is cheap, but it faces opposition because even our king in England, he doesn't like seeing wind farms on the landscape. Offshore, yes, that seems to be acceptable. Again, there's been a huge uptake in solar power, but these solar power farms face the same kind of opposition because of their unsightliness. At the bottom, nuclear revival. We saw nuclear coming in quite a couple of decades ago, but it lost favor, mostly because of people's regard to safety. And if we just go to the last slide, as I said, nuclear has had a mercurial history. And it was once being propagated as the future energy source for cheap electricity. But people don't like having nuclear power plants in their backyard because of possible radiation leaks. What happened with Chernobyl and Fukushima in Japan, people feel that they're living next to a nuclear bomb and a possible terrorist to target. So does nuclear really have a future? And I can't answer that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Cleveland, it's up to you. Can you
Yeah,
control slides?
yeah. Let me see if I can put some slides up here. Uh, Not going up. Just a second. What? Am I not allowed to put up my slides?
Let me help you, no problem.
There. Okay. I wanted to follow up on some of what Paul said, because looking forward is really, of course, a very risky approach. But we've had so many different entities, as we can see at the bottom there, BP, VIA, the IEA, and all of these other entities. They're all looking forward to 2030, 2040, 2050, and they all are very optimistic in putting big chunks of renewables in the energy mix, and of course much lower chunks of coal, oil, and fossil fuels in general. Those are optimistic numbers for renewables, but they're all predictions, and they all depend on what's going to happen in the next few years. Let me go forward here, just one. Oh, come on, move forward. I can't move forward.
Oh, sure, no problem.
Likewise, if you look out beyond 2030 or 2040 or 2050 or even 2100, many entities have made these projections. And then, of course, all bets are off because it depends a little bit on some ideology. Of course, the peak oil guys have an idea that everything will gravitate to renewables, and oil and gas will be long gone. Other entities, AAPG, and major companies putting out forecasts beyond 2050, for example, they are optimistic about renewables, but you can see that there's a big mix of whether the fossil fuels will decline a lot or a little or almost not at all. Next, Ryan, please.
Sure.
One of the things that Paul pointed out is that much of this is driven by technology driving down costs, and he's right. This is the kind of cost that we've seen in at least the major renewable energies that we're discussing: solar, and offshore wind and even onshore wind. Costs are going way down. Whereas, of course, fossil fuels are not changing much and of course, volatile with geopolitical crises and so on. So this was a projection back then. And the next slide, Cavagna, is reality because the costs have come down. And even though this is from 2021, they're showing costs for 2023 because some of these costs are based on the contracts that are signed in 2021 to furnish electricity and so on out into the future at set rates. And those rates are already reflecting major decreases. And that is still going on. So there's no question that costs, at least for some of these major alternative energies, such as solar or even concentrating solar, not photovoltaic, onshore wind and offshore wind, they are coming down. So naturally, there's no question that at least for the foreseeable 5, even 10 years, those costs will drive very significant, next Ryan, please, very significant increases. The key here is where those increases will happen, because we're all very aware that Europe and the US are driving some technologies, but where are really the technologies likely to take over in a big way in the energy mix? It's exactly in less developed countries, maybe the southern hemisphere, because we've been energy poor for a long time. And a lot of these regions have an energy mix which is still reflective of energy poverty of their population. So going forward, for them, it will be much easier to implement new energy sources. Yeah, then the next one, Ryan. You'll see.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you'll see that this is where the energy, the new energies are being put in. But look at the left-hand scale. This is logarithmic. The scale of the energy capacity of each addition is very different. So we do face a lot of challenges in putting in, for example, solar panels and solar farms. Yes, they're wonderful. They're increasing dramatically, but individually, they're not as large individually as usually the average nuclear, coal power, or even some large hydroelectric projects and so on. But we do have to keep in mind the scale, because that is how we change the energy mix one project at a time. Next one, please. You see that Paul also pointed out that, yes, capital costs are considerable for some of these renewable energies. We throw in nuclear because it's an alternative, obviously not renewable if you're using uranium fuel. But of course, nowadays we're talking about reprocessing. So even though it's not renewable, it basically extends the usability of this fuel for a long time. It's almost renewable with a lot of technical problems, obviously, but they're still called renewable. But the capital cost of putting in these projects is very big. So for given capacity factors, which nuclear is very positive, some gas turbines as well, but some of the other ones not so much favorable capacity usage. And of course, the capital costs are extremely high in relation to, for example, gas peaking plants, which are relatively expensive, even though they don't have high capacity usage because they're basically peaking units. Next. So this is not so recent, but it's very important. And I go on from here because a while back, we were looking at technologies that can change how energy is being produced. And this is basically looking at how CO2, which is the whole deal about decarbonization and going to net zero, how we can use CO2 to produce fuels. And all of these technologies that were foreseen to be important in 5 or 10 years, they're still 5 or 10 years away. The technologies that were foreseen to be 10 or 15 years away, yes, we're working on that, but there's still a big challenge. And obviously, if you go looking out far into the future. Those things are too far in the future to be able to say anything about, but we've been working on new technologies that can maybe make a major difference. And after we were done with the presentations, I might want to say something about that. Next, Maya. And there are reasons, though, to be optimistic that indeed, in general, clean energy or renewables or alternative energies will be indeed reaching their place in society and economies, as Paul said, as the governments are trying to achieve for various reasons: energy security, cost, as well as decarbonization and climate change goals. So you see that in the past 2 years, fossil fuels and clean energy investments were more or less the same. And as of 2018, 2019, clean energy investments in various types of energies just took off. And this is even more exaggerated as of the end of 2023 and going forward in 2024. So we're looking at very major changes, which give us a little reason to be optimistic that despite all these challenges, clean energy, renewables are making headway. And one more, Ryan. This is, again, not so recent, but it shows very dramatically, renewables of various types outpacing dramatically investments in coal and gas, in part because coal and gas are relatively inexpensive. So the investment in renewables doesn't necessarily translate into the same amount of energy output, but at least the investment dollars are going into renewables. And this is dramatic, and it's accelerating this trend. There's one more, Ryan. Again, another way of looking at it. If you look at photovoltaic and wind, the trends are dramatic. They're increasing very fast in the coal, in the bio, in the nuclear. Yes, we may see some changes in coal going down. Hydro, there's limited potential, of course, throughout the world. All of the big projects, Three Gorges, Itaipu, and so on, they're basically done. Now we're scraping the bottom of the barrel for smaller hydro projects. But what is really counting when we look at the scale is solar and wind, and we will continue to see a significant reliance on gas turbine energy for peaking, for maintaining grid stability, which is essential to allow the renewables to fit into the grid. I think we can go one more, Ryan. No, that's it. I wanted to say we have to talk about technology, but I want to talk about it. I didn't want to put a lot of techie stuff on the slides. So we leave it at that, Ryan.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Cleveland and Paul, by the introductions. Let me ask you both, please, especially for wind and solar. Do you consider or do not consider weaknesses and as intense mining, intermittence, microclimate influence in the regions of farms, wind and solar farms, decommissioning complications with difficult materials to be destroyed? So
you let me go first?
Sure.
Let me say this, Kamaya. These are all challenges that are being brought up, and they're real in countries where wind and solar are beginning to be significant. If you're up into the 20, 25, even 30% of the grid in renewables, yes, you begin to have very serious problems with stability. Grid expansion is necessary, and so on. But you have to look at the rest of the world where these renewable energy sources are not 20 or 30%. That is not a problem. You're starting from zero. So until you get to that, wind and
for
solar,
example, which country do you mean?
Well, even in Brazil, which is big in wind and solar, we're still not even close to saturating the grid with wind and solar. We are beginning to see the need to expand the grid, strengthen the grid in order to provide integration. But if you look at Southeast Asia, or if you look at Africa, or if you look at other South America, the growth potential is enormous until you get to 20 or 30% renewables. So those challenges don't really come into play. Now, the materials challenges will come into play worldwide as critical materials, metals, mining becomes a geopolitical tool, just like energy withdrawal from the market was. Fortunately, as we discussed even in the other program, nowadays lithium, even though it's so concentrated, the projects out there in the world to churn out lithium in the kind of scale that was inconceivable a while back, from the triangle in South America, from Africa, even from the U.S., which I think will lead, and surpass all others, from lithium from oil field produced water and so on. The potential is so big that those challenges are not so significant right now.
Paul, based on what you said in your presentation, wind and solar could replace nuclear, coal, and this kind of energy. So do you believe on that?
I'm not sure at this particular point in time if wind and solar can replace, because we have a lot of environmental factors. Do we have wind? Do we have where I live here in the UK, we have very little sun. But certainly, I don't see anything replacing nuclear. Nuclear is like a standalone, and that's a separate subject on its own. At the moment, no, I don't see replacement. But to
an addition,
it's yes, I think there will be replacement, but at the moment we don't really see it. It's
in 50 years,
possibly. Well, it's a prediction. And that's a prediction I'm not prepared to make. But to build on what Cleveland was saying, at a much smaller scale, people don't know, or they're not told, that they can switch energy suppliers that supply renewable green energy. They just say, okay, my electricity supply company is this one. I have to accept what they're giving me. They don't know that they can phone up and say, I want to switch supplier to this energy supplier because the power is coming from a wind farm or a solar panel farm. They don't know. And is that, in inverted commas, ignorance due to censorship, or is it due to just simply not knowing that they can do it and how to change?
Paul, just let me say, for example, Brazil just went through legislation to provide a freer energy market. So what you're saying is beginning to become really the standard across the world, where consumers, even certainly industrial large consumers, but also mid consumers and now even small consumers, to have those choices. Part of the problem is that not everybody is sold on the idea of going green or renewable, but at least the choice is there.
Yeah, because when I was living in Aberdeen, there was a large wind farm installed offshore, and people were saying that you could select that company. Yeah. I didn't know which company to call up and ask if I could switch to them.
Do you both believe that's more related to CO2 reduction or more related to competitiveness, the renewables coming?
Oh, that's I don't know how to answer that, because we see a lot of news about carbon footprints and how we can reduce the carbon footprints, and everything that you purchase these days has a carbon footprint, and it's there on the label. You have the choice of purchasing that article over that article based on its carbon footprint. So,
but Paul, let me say this: you're right. that choice is up to the consumer to a great extent, but it's maybe a false choice because under the guise of environmental advantages of decarbonization, we've forgotten that there's other dimensions, water use. And of course, making a solar panel is incredibly intensive in water use. Critical
Yeah.
metals are intensive. So
Yeah.
the choice should not just be, are we really focused on, 1.5? Nowadays we have to be realistic. It's trying to hold the 2%. We're not going to hold the 1.5% temperature increase. Is that the goal? I think that there's other goals, and gradually I think people are becoming more aware that there's more to the whole decision process than just decarbonization. They have to look at even equity. How are some of these minerals mined in Africa in order to supply what we use in alternative energies? So I think the education element is important, and it has to grow because there are very serious impacts that go beyond just carbon footprint, such as water footprint, mineral footprint, social impacts, and so on. How we're going to deal with those and how we're going to convey those to the population. It's not like the oil companies that for a good while, really were gung ho on taking over wind projects. No, some of them are rethinking that. But nowadays, I think they all recognize that it's not a solution just to go all for one technology because this is less carbon intensive, because there's other concerns as well.
Compensations.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, exactly, because was it today that they launched a satellite that will monitor the output of methane? And interestingly, methane only resides in the atmosphere for 20 years, whereas carbon is for hundreds of years. So if they can eradicate quickly the facilities that are polluting the atmosphere with methane, then we can have a big impact on the climate much quicker. And this is coming from this methane satellite.
Do you mean natural gas plants and processes?
The
Everything.
methane seeps from every. I've written a lot about this. We're becoming aware exactly because of what Paul says. We have now more technology to identify the seeps and where they are, where they're coming from, and it's flabbergasting. I mean, some of these seeps are not seeps; they're torrents of methane that we
Yeah,
weren't aware of.
that's right. Any oil field that is flaring still, that's pumping out methane
Yeah.
into the atmosphere.
I
It's
would
amazing.
like to. Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, it's as Paul said. I think that is right. This is one of the reasons why I think we have to refocus not just on the energy sources, but on what actions we can take to decarbonize that are not related to the types of energy. Certainly, controlling methane seeps is one of the top measures, actions that we can take that's proactive. And then we gain a little bit more flexibility in energy types so that we can address other concerns besides just climate change effects.
And
Yeah.
end-to-end process, analyze end-to-end process. Yes.
Yeah, and we're all old enough to remember the outcry about the use of polystyrene, and McDonald's was blamed for our adoption of using polystyrene, and the hole in the ozone layer, and that we're all using cardboard now. I'd like to see us to move away from plastic bottles to glass bottles, to be honest. But
Of course, many of those actions can be rethought in the name of environmental quality, less pollution, not just CO2 or equivalent reductions from energy sources. So naturally, I agree 100%. And I think, you, Kavanya just had John Foreman, also a big nuclear exponent. Nuclear has to be at the base. That is a realization that the world is coming to terms with, because we've realized that the accidents and the fear is unfounded, so that we can become more rational in our choices and put things where they belong.
Guys,
Nuclear energy
please
at the base.
teach me how to be so optimistic, because it's so good to see you both laughing and saying so good things
Well,
about
Cavagna knows that sometimes I'm quite pessimistic, but no, the reason, Cavagna and Paul, that I'm so optimistic is because I deal with a lot of new technology projects and research in various areas with my colleagues, Paulo Almeida at the University, Federal University of Bahia, for example, developing technologies which we think can upscale fast because all of these pie in the sky energies, wave and sea currents and so on. They don't have the scale. They don't have the time frames. A lot of these are just pie in the sky. They won't have an effect in time and at the scale that we need. Yet some of the technologies that we're discussing, for example, gold hydrogen from depleted oil fields with microbiological processes, can be scaled up so fast because all you need is to open up those closed oil wells, inject stuff, and get hydrogen out. Gold hydrogen could be a game changer, maybe in 5 or 10 years, not too long, not 20, not 15 even. And this is an alternative, for example, that can be a lot quicker than the nuclear renaissance, because nuclear still is a long process from approval to implementation. But there are other technologies like that which give us cause to be optimistic.
Yeah, but I think, Cleveland, your slide, if you want to show it again, on the investment.
Sure.
Yeah.
Which one?
Back.
No, that one, yeah. I think a lot of that investment is coming from corporate, but I'm sure there's national investment by governments as well.
Yeah.
It's showing, like I said, that the corporate investment is coming because it's no longer seen as a trendy fashion. It's seen as something that's part of our economy and our energy usage.
But you see, there's only one reason to temper that optimism, is that this scale is dollars. Dollars invested in clean energy are producing much less kilowatt power than dollars invested in fossil fuels, which is a reality because fossil fuel energy, gas plants, and so on, for relatively little investment, you get a lot of bang for the buck. With alternative energies, renewables, and so on, generally you have to put in a lot more. Nowadays, maybe solar is starting to break that barrier because solar is becoming significantly cheaper. We don't know how much less, but certainly it's at the point where it's competing with coal, for example. So
but Cleveland,
we can say that maybe that helps.
Yeah, but Cleveland could be interesting to include subsidies bars in this graph too, no?
Yes, I fight about that a lot.
Yeah.
Paul, a while back, I forget now the numbers, I posted a big spiel about subsidies and how harmful they are. And we complain, and a lot of people who are against this, climate change movement say, oh, why are we putting subsidies into wind and solar? Hey, we're putting a lot of billions of dollars of subsidies into fossil fuels as well. I think they all should disappear. We should be discussing technical costs of implementation. Mining, transmission, implementation.
The subsidies help those people who can't afford to transition. They can't afford to change their gas-powered boiler to a very expensive heat pump. A gas-powered boiler in the UK will cost you more than £1,000. A heat pump is going to cost you thousands of pounds. So poor people can't afford that transition.
Now, that's a very good point, because now we're talking about actions which I don't think are directly related to energy production, but to efficiency. And a heat pump is tremendously efficient in relation to heating a house with fuel oil or LPG or whatever, and even cooling a house, which would generally be with electricity and pumps and so on. Compressors are not very efficient. So this again points to very effective investments in energy efficiency. And if we were to do that, well, I also produce something with students about, the motors in the energy consumption represent a tremendous amount of power usage. We're looking at Brazil, which is maybe even further back, but even in the United States, with the tremendous installed industrial capacity with motors of all types, electric motors, if they were just moved up to the average, the savings would be tremendous, which shows that energy efficiency has to be the top priority. And if it requires some subsidies, I agree that that's where they should be going, because that's the subsidies for reduction in use, not for promoting a specific energy
Okay,
type.
but you've just generated a point, which is why are students looking at creating and building heat pumps, as an example? Why are they looking at these alternative um, appliances for heating homes when before we just tried to make the gas boilers and the oil boilers more efficient? But people are starting to look at alternative ways of heating homes and buildings. And I'm sure there are other examples that I can't think of, but why are students looking at this? Corporate money
But Paul,
must be driving some of this.
yeah, Paul, the efficiency increase is just out of this world. I mean, even electricity use, just considering cooling houses, for example, now we have the heating globally, a lot of places are becoming very uncomfortable. Cooling a house with normal air conditioners or with the heat pump, tremendous difference. And you get a heater for the winter season, for the same bang. So the difference, the discrepancy is tremendous. Now, I agree, there's other efficiencies as well. If we look at physical losses in all sectors of the economy, even transmission lines, which we're going to higher voltage lines and so on, these are investments that pay off because they reduce the demand for electricity. In
What
Brazil, the new concessions that we're doing from all of these far off hydroelectric, the transmission lines are much higher voltage because they save the losses, which were in some cases 20 or more percent of the energy produced. By the time they get to the distribution lines, the energy losses can be reduced to 8 or 10%. So there is fantastic savings as well.
Yeah, going to the conclusions, my last question is related to growth of renewables in the next 2 decades. What the predictions you both guys have about the volume, the percent of the total electricity? Because we need to make a difference between products from oil, petrochemical, etc., and electricity. So renewables is only viable for electricity. How do you expect the growth of renewables worldwide speaking?
Paul, if you let me go,
I think it's going to be linear for quite some time, but then it'll go exponential.
yeah, it has to eventually,
Wow,
otherwise
really?
it won't make a difference, right?
Yeah, but I think
That's the key.
with acceptance and
Yeah,
with acceptance and people saying, okay, fossil fuels don't have a future, I'm going to have to think about something alternative. That's when we'll move from a linear growth to exponential. But how steep that exponential curve will be, I have absolutely no idea. So over to you, Cleveland.
yeah. A while back, I don't remember all the details, but we had a program about net zero, and even there I was optimistic exactly for the same reasons. Technology can take over and exponentially increase some technology, some energy sources that we don't think are really so viable now. But exactly technology is the key, because we can't extrapolate based solely on the current cost advantage for these this growth to take over a significant portion of the energy mix. It
When
has to
you
be based on something else.
when you
Well,
say technologies, you mean batteries, technologies, sun
Storage. Let's say storage,
efficiency
not
to
necessarily
capture
batteries.
energy.
Yeah, storage nowadays, for example, pumped storage and hydro will become a very significant uh, uh, part of the grid stabilization uh, characteristics because it will need stabilization. Where will it come from? Batteries just can't do it, no matter, even if they come down in price 90%, it's just still going to be not viable. Storage has to be some other way. And pumped storage is a big part of it, other storage mechanisms as well, but also technologies for energy savings and technology for energy sources that we don't contemplate now, even some that I mentioned, from CO2 conversion
Yeah,
into methane and so on.
but still having dispatchable energy like natural gas backup in the continent.
I think that's where we differ a bit, Paul. I think that the fossil fuels will have a long life,
oh, yeah.
declining. Yeah, but they can't go away even in 50 years, unfortunately. Personally, I think that petrochemicals will not necessarily be the source of the demand for hydrocarbons because even biofuels can supply a
Can
lot.
replace this
Yeah,
technology.
but they will be necessary because there will be many places in the world which will still be reliant on fossil fuels, and that is a reality that 50 years from now maybe will change. So
50
we have
years.
to rely on the growth of some renewables technologies to bring in efficiencies. Otherwise, we won't be able to get there. But I think we will. So that means
Yeah,
technology
Paul.
will rise.
Paul, your vision, Paul.
Sorry?
Paul, your vision about the growth.
Well, as Cleveland says, fossil fuels are going to be around for a very long time because there's a lot of countries that are um, energy rich, but they're not financially rich. And they are not going to adopt renewables when they've got a lot of hydrocarbons sitting in the ground that can be produced quickly, easily, and cheaply for. So fossil fuels are going to be around for a very long time. But in places like Europe, North America, South America, Asia, I think we're going to see a gradual increase in the adoption of renewables. It's not something I'm encouraged about. Some of it is being forced on us by the realization that global climate change is happening. Um, it's being forced on us by governments with a net zero targets. But a lot of people, and I'm not going to give you a percentage of the population because I have absolutely no idea what it is, but they want to use renewables. They don't want fossil fuels. Although I do suspect we'll be buying bars of soap in about 25 years' time saying, still made from fossil fuels, and they'll be boasting about it.
Congratulations by your optimism, both guys, friends. Congratulations.
Very good.
It's not the feeling I have. Okay.
Like I said, call me in 10 or 20 years and let's see who's right.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
No,
Very
pleasure.
good.
I enjoyed I enjoyed the session and the experience. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thank you.
Paul.
Thank you
Thanks.
so
Goodbye.
much. Thank you. Closing our